In November 2024, the territory of the Caucasus state of Georgia was lit up with protests. In the capital city, Tbilisi, and other cities, crowds took to the streets in opposition to what was seen as an unfair and fraudulent election result. This was not the first occasion of mass unrest affecting the nation in recent years. The previous year, 2023, saw equally massive protests against a proposed law which was widely seen as enabling greater Russian influence over Georgia. The protests have continued, and the political future of the country hangs in the balance. Interestingly, and unprecedentedly, simultaneous protests have occurred in Sukhumi, the largest city in the breakaway Georgian region of Abkhazia. And while the concurrent sequences of upheaval occurred for different reasons, there is one thing they might have in common. Both are underpinned by opposition to the unending meddling of Russia in its neighbors' affairs, manifested in two quite different ways. So let's take a look. Georgia is a country which has struggled under the yoke of Russian or Soviet influence for generations. Being a part of the Soviet Union since 1921, the country occupied a position which arguably outweighed its small geographical size and population. Aside from being a key frontier where the USSR met NATO in the form of Turkey, Georgia was the republic from which many of the most recognizable names of the Soviet era originated. Notorious NKVD chief Lavrentiy Beria, People's Commissar of Heavy Industries Sergei Orjonikidze, and of course the so-called Vojt, Joseph Stalin himself. They were all natives of the small country. Unfortunately for Georgia, Russia's intrusion continued even after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. By 1993, the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia broke away with the help of Russian forces and declared independence. Georgia labored in the shadow of its neighbor for most of the following decade, punctuated in 2004 by a political revolution and popular demand for democracy and greater ties with the EU and NATO. But its Euro-Atlanticist aspirations have come at a price, and Georgia has cyclically seen itself exposed to more Russian interference and the threat of another invasion from its neighbor. Moreover, Georgians have had to contend with a transition hampered by their own political class, which has seen the country remain in the sphere of influence of Russia despite the wishes of the public, which brings us to today. So, to truly understand all this, let's go back to the start of the 1990s and a new dawn for the nations previously part of both the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Like others, Georgia's experience of nation building was rife with difficulty. For much of the decade, Georgia labored not only under the fallout of the Abkhaz and South Ossetian drives for secession, but also its own Russia-friendly leadership. From 1995, the state was led by a man who'd previously spent 13 years as its leader during communism. This was Eduard Shevardnadze, who was elected first secretary of the Communist Party of Georgia all the way back in 1972. Shevardnadze continued as first secretary until 1985, leaving to become foreign minister of the Soviet Union as it entered the Gorbachev era. He returned to Georgia in 1991 and founded the Union of Citizens of Georgia, or UCG, before becoming its country's second president 2 years later. During communism, Shevardnadze had largely held a sympathetic public opinion, attempting to bring in reforms and crack down on corruption. But his popularity waned following independence, largely due to the conflict in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The conflicts had led to a 2-year civil war in Georgia, during which Shevardnadze sought military assistance from Russia's military alliance, the Commonwealth of Independent States. This led not only to the toppling and death of Georgia's first president, Zavad Gamsagariya, but all but assured the de facto independence of both its breakaway states. In 2001, Shevardnadze announced that he would not stand for re-election in 2005, turning him into a lame duck. By then, Georgia had become ferociously corrupt, though. In 2002, Transparency International's annual Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Georgia a measly 2.4 out of 10 on a corruption scale. The country came in 85th out of 102 surveyed countries, 6 places behind Venezuela, and no less than 15 behind Russia. Shortly after Shevardnadze's announcement, Justice Minister Mikhail Saakashvili resigned and founded the opposition United National Movement, or Natsevi. This party went on to achieve success in the 2003 parliamentary elections, clinching 18% of the electoral vote and finishing close behind Shevardnadze's bloc at 22%. Popular protests led by the opposition began soon after, which would lead to a key moment in Georgia's post-independence history. The so-called Rose Revolution in November 2003 was the first in a series of democratic upheavals which shook multiple post-Soviet states. These were known as the Color Revolutions, and the events in Georgia were followed by similar developments in Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Ukraine again, and Armenia. Hope for change was in the air in Georgia, and Shevardnadze resigned as president as the Rose Revolution reached its zenith. 1 month later, Saakashvili replaced him as president and began to introduce sweeping reforms. Georgia changed its flag from the dull design of the Shevardnadze era to the so-called five-cross flag, and Saakashvili began to crack down on political corruption and oligarchy. He postured himself as tough on crime and memorably dismissed 30,000 members of the police force of Georgia in one swoop to snuff out corruption. This resulted in Georgia not having a single traffic police officer on duty for a period of 3 months in 2004. And for a few years, Saakashvili's shock therapy seemed to bear fruit. Georgia's corruption rate tumbled, its economy grew, and per capita income tripled. The country also came to be ranked by the World Bank as among the countries with the greatest ease of doing business in the world in the 2010s, and was also named the leading economic reformer in the world. But the changes, they came at a steep cost. Saakashvili's predecessor, Shevardnadze, had been the preferred candidate of Russia, which would begin to take a keener interest in its neighbors' affairs after his downfall. In the more immediate period, the political change spelled trouble among Georgia's secessionist movements. Shevardnadze had been their preferred candidate, largely because of his perceived leniency towards them, and the secessionists did absolutely not feel the same way about Saakashvili. The Rose Revolution was quickly followed by yet another territorial crisis when in 2004, the tiny autonomous region of Abkhazia threatened violent schism. In the end, conflict was avoided, but the incident did not bode well for Georgia, and the domestic security situation would get even worse in just a few years. In the meantime, criticism of Saakashvili's government began to grow. Some of this criticism was directed towards his reforms, but much was directed at a series of severe controversies in which the United National Movement Party became embroiled. In January 2006, the head of the United Georgian Bank's foreign department, 28-year-old Sandro Gaviliani, was found beaten to death on the outskirts of Tbilisi. Heavily implicated in his abduction and murder was Saakashvili's Minister of Internal Affairs, Varno Merabishvili. Over time, the outcry over the circumstances of the murder became a major domestic scandal. But only a few weeks after Gaviliani's death, another controversial killing took place. In February 2006, retired policeman Gia Talia was killed in a shootout with state security forces under contested circumstances. Once again, the Interior Ministry was implicated. Despite this, after an active first term, Saakashvili managed to secure re-election in 2008 with a landslide 54% of the vote. He continued his ambition towards forging greater ties with the West and signed into effect Georgia's intention to join NATO at the military alliance's annual summit in Bucharest in April 2008. But storm clouds were massing on the horizon. 4 months after the Bucharest Agreement, Russia launched a full-scale ground invasion of Georgia. Military units swept across the Caucasus Mountains, and with the assistance of separatist paramilitaries in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they quickly overcame the Georgian defenders. Peace was secured after 5 days of fighting, but ethnic Georgians poured out of the occupied regions into the hinterland, and Russia unilaterally recognized both regions as independent 2 weeks after hostilities ceased. Saakashvili was undeterred and signed into effect the so-called Law on Occupied Territories in October 2008, which reaffirmed the breakaway regions as the sovereign territory of Georgia and criminalized entry by any route other than through Georgia itself. But public favor was slipping out of his hands. The trauma of the military invasion was compounded by the feelings of some Georgians that Saakashvili had played fast and loose with their security through his uncompromising stance on Russia. And things got even worse. Saakashvili's zero-tolerance policy on crime had resulted in the number of inmates in Georgia's prisons almost tripling, reaching 25,000 in 2012. But in September of that year, videos were published which revealed sadistic abuse of inmates, most notably the Gladani prison in Tbilisi, which some nicknamed the Georgian Abu Ghraib. Prisoners were shown to be tortured by prison staff, including by being violated with broom handles. The Gladani scandal caused revulsion in Georgia, and protests began to form all across the country. Some protesters carried placards calling for a revolution of brooms, a play on the preceding Rose Revolution, and a reference to the instruments with which the prison inmates were tortured. Saakashvili attempted to rally, but his response to the brutality connected to his government was chaotic. He first attempted to deny the veracity of the footage, labeling it as a smear campaign by his political opponents. elections. When this failed, he instructed his prime minister to conduct an in-person sweep of all Georgia's prisons and suspended the entirety of the country's prison staff. But that prime minister just so happened to be Varno Merabishvili, the former Minister of Internal Affairs, who was himself implicated in no less than 2 political killings. And all of this unfolded only 2 weeks before the 2012 parliamentary elections. To nobody's surprise, the United National Movement's performance at the ballots declined sharply. They received 40% of the vote, losing almost half their seats as well as their parliamentary majority. Saakashvili was constitutionally barred from seeking a new term as president in 2013 and moved to the United States. He later relocated to Ukraine, where he held the post of governor of Odessa between 2015 and 2016. But back in Georgia, the political void left room for the rise of a new party, founded in 2012 by oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, which would go on to dominate the country from then on. That party was known as Georgian Dream. Bidzina Ivanishvili is a Georgian businessman and exactly who a country with ambitions toward moving away from Russian influence wouldn't want in power. He became rich in Russia in the 1990s, following the same blueprint to wealth as other oligarchs of the era by buying up newly privatized assets and reselling them at a huge profit. According to Forbes, his wealth in 2023 stood at $4.9 billion, making him, by some margin, the richest man in Georgia. Ivanishvili's wealth is so great that it's thought to equal around 1/5 of the entirety of Georgia's GDP. Despite his success, Ivanishvili relocated from Russia to France in 2002, where he remained when the Rose Revolution began the following year. According to former Russian spy chief Sergei Narishkin, Ivanishvili had flared out of our knees at the rise of a new Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, who he feared would crack down on politically ambitious businessmen. Politically ambitious was certainly one way of putting it. In fact, Ivanishvili's political leanings already showed clear signs of chameleonism. In the 1990s, he had supported the Russian presidential campaign of Alexander Lebed, a former lieutenant general in the Soviet army. Lebed was despised in Ivanishvili's native country for his role in the violent suppression of pro-independence protests in 1989, which had left 21 people dead. By 2012, Ivanishvili had returned to Georgia and founded Georgian Dream, also known as Kutsebi. Going into the elections that year, the party formed a political alliance with no less than 5 other opposition parties, including the memorably named Industry Will Save Georgia. It also made sure to draw as much attention as possible to the scandal surrounding state brutality, especially the Gladani prison affair. The alliance romped to a majority 53% vote in the 2012 elections and eclipsed the government in number of parliamentary seats. The following year, Ivanishvili became prime minister in place of the disgraced Varno Merabishvili, who was immediately flung in prison. Georgian Dream turned out to be exactly as opportunistic as its leader. The party started out life ostensibly in favor of European integration and greater involvement with NATO. In 2014, Georgia signed an association agreement with the EU, a step towards membership, and in 2017, it secured visa-free travel to the Schengen area for Georgian passport holders. But over time, it revealed itself as the polar opposite, displaying near-naked Russophilia and authoritarianism as it secured increased control over the parliament. In 2021, Saakashvili somewhat unexpectedly returned to Georgia and was promptly arrested. During his absence, he had been accused and convicted by the state of abuse of power, embezzlement, and a violent assault against a Georgian Dream member of parliament. Saakashvili joined his former prime minister, Merabishvili, in prison and has remained there ever since. Meanwhile, Georgian Dream went on to dominate the parliamentary elections in both 2016 and 2020, now running as a standalone party. And with that, Georgia's dream of Euro-Atlantic integration slowly slipped out of the window. Ivanishvili forgot all about his past opposition to Putin, and his party began to openly flirt with their erstwhile invaders and occupiers. In 2019, a symposium centered around the Orthodox faith was held in the Georgian parliament, during which the speaker's chair was occupied by Sergei Gavrilov, a member of the Russian State Duma from the Communist Party. This led to public outrage, and hundreds of protesters attempted to storm the parliament building, leading to multiple arrests and injuries. But the incident was only a taste of what was to come. Over the following years, Georgian Dream began to implement legislation largely at odds with the public, which sent Georgia spiraling back under the influence of Russia. For a long period, the party continued to avoid, at least overtly, opposing Georgia's aim to join the EU and NATO. To do so would be unconstitutional due to an amendment introduced in 2018. Article 78 of the Georgian Constitution states, "The constitutional bodies shall take all measures within the scope of their competences to ensure the full integration of Georgia into the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization." Instead, Georgian Dream began to undermine attempts at greater ties with the West through damaging rhetoric and with the implementation of legislation forging closer ties with Russia. Perhaps the most cogent example of this was the introduction of a wildly controversial new law in March 2023. The so-called Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence required all organizations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence. In practice, this allowed the government to submit such organizations to oversight by the Ministry of Justice and to require them to disclose sensitive information on their functioning. This would restrict the influence of NGOs on civil society, including several which have played a significant role in political developments in the country in the past. Georgian Dream lawmakers claimed that the law copied an American piece of legislation, the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938. But the Georgian bill was much more sweeping, targeting organizations rather than individuals and more directly resembling a foreign agent law passed in Russia in 2012. Moreover, a second bill expanded the scope of so-called agents of foreign influence to individuals as well, and increased the penalty for failure to comply from fines up to 5 years in prison. The law passed through a vote in the Georgian parliament with 84 votes in favor and only 4 against. Practically all opposition MPs abstained from the vote, referring to the bill as the Russian law. French-born President Salome Zourabichvili attempted to use her veto power to strike it down, but this was overridden by the Georgian Dream-dominated parliament. In response, massive protests erupted on the streets of Georgian cities once more, some of the largest since independence in 1991. On this occasion, the protests were met with a vicious response from security forces. Protesters were showered with water cannons and blitzed by stun grenades and tear gas. Dozens were arrested or hospitalized, and several Georgian opposition figures reported being beaten or harassed by gangs of cloaked men. In the wake of the massive protests, the law was withdrawn. But 2 months later, another controversial bill was introduced, which led to more controversy. In May, the leader of Georgia's parliamentary majority warned that the United States demonstrated that, quote, LGBT propaganda could increase the number of members of the LGBT community. This was followed by a draft law entitled On Family Values and the Protection of Minors, introduced by Georgian Dream in June. The bill, which again mirrored Russian legislation, included the banning of same-sex marriage, adoption by same-sex couples, gender-affirming care, and depictions of LGBT-identifying people in the media. President Zourabichvili vetoed the legislation, but was once more overruled by the parliament and the bill was signed into law. Unsurprisingly, the unfolding developments largely torpedoed Georgia's bid to join the EU. On July 9, 2023, the European Parliament announced that accession talks had been halted. Moreover, the following spring saw Georgian Dream revive the disputed foreign agents law, which was, as usual, struck down by the president. On this occasion, however, the parliament doubled down on their initiative, and the bill was signed into law in May 2024. This effectively left the Georgian bid for EU membership in tatters. But there was one silver lining on the horizon. The public would have the chance to vote out the architects of their undoing with the 2024 parliamentary election. As you might predict, however, that is exactly what didn't end up happening. The run-up to the October 2024 elections was marked by lingering outrage over the Foreign Agents Law. Georgian Dream, mask now discarded, assumed the role of pantomime villain with aplomb, masking overtures toward the Kremlin with increasingly little guile. 1 month before the election, Bidzina Ivanishvili provoked astonishment and outrage by offering to apologize to Russia for Georgia opening fire on South Ossetia at the outset of the 2008 war. Speaking at a rally in Gori, Stalin's place of origin, Ivanishvili blamed Mikhail Saakashvili and the United National Movement for the war and ominously claimed that its members would be subject to a, quote, Nuremberg-style trial after the election. Therein, Ivanishvili seemed to let something slip, which many Georgians already suspected, that the upcoming election was effectively a sham, with the results already decided. Georgian Dream ended up securing 53% of the vote, a loss of only 1 seat against the most recent election in 2020. The closest challenger, the Pro-Rest Coalition for Change, receiving a paltry 11%, and the United National Movement scraping third with a measly 10%. Astounded, and outraged Georgians poured into the streets once more, but things quickly got even worse. Now, amidst all the upheaval occurring in Georgia's major cities, there are two regions where protests against Russia's influence were highly unlikely. Those are, of course, the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. South Ossetia, a region whose entire population is a grand total of just 56,000, largely slept through the instability of 2023 and 2024, as always. But the situation was different in the Black Sea region of Abkhazia. Abkhazia, with a population estimated to be 250,000, was, like South Ossetia and Adjaria, an autonomous oblast within the Georgian SSR during the Soviet era. In 1993, it strove for independence, joining South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh in seceding with the help of Russia. A bloody conflict took place, during which thousands of ethnic Georgians were driven out of Abkhazia amidst allegations of ethnic cleansing and even genocide. Participants in the conflict on the side of Abkhaz separatists included the Russian Air Force, insurgents from Chechnya, ethnic Armenian paramilitaries, as well as volunteers from other Russian republics. The Abkhazians are a northwest Caucasian ethnic group closely related to the Circassian people. They are thought to make up around half of Abkhazia's population, with ethnic Armenians, Georgians, and Russians making up most of the rest. The region has been particularly closely linked to Russia for generations. Known for its picturesque views over the Black Sea, it was a common holiday destination for members of the Soviet hierarchy and continues to remain so for Russian tourists today. Abkhazia also made a significant contribution to Russian language literature in the form of Fasil Iskander, a native of its largest city, Sukhumi, and a celebrated literary figure in Russia to this day. Yet despite all of this, recent events have shown that the Abkhaz people are not universally satisfied with their Russian-secured status quo. Around the time of the contested Georgian election between the Abkhaz separatist government and Russia that would allow Russian citizens to buy property in the breakaway region. Vicious protests erupted, which saw crowds amass in front of the parliament building in Sukhumi and use a truck to smash their way through its metal gates. Videos showed people climbing through the building's windows and chanting in the corridors. Now, it's difficult to say whether the protests were actually attempting to address the strong influence of Russia upon the region per se. Many protesters who stormed the parliament carried both Abkhaz and Russian flags and took pains to insist they were not opposed to ties with Russia, but rather the content of the deal, which they claimed would price locals out of the property market. That said, to openly declare opposition to the long-standing ties with Russia would likely be suicide. But the fact that the protests occurred at all is already significant. As the protests grew, Russian media reported that an Abkhaz militia had been relocated from Ukraine's Donbass to help quell the unrest. Ultimately, the protests resulted in the resignation of the Abkhaz president Arslan Bajania, leaving the framework agreement in limbo. Ongoing protests and analysis. Back to goings-on in the Georgian capital. Following the October election, the European Parliament released a statement describing them as neither free nor fair. The same statement added that the election constituted, quote, yet another manifestation of the continued democratic backsliding of the country for which the ruling Georgian Dream Party is fully responsible. The Georgian government, in response, announced that it was suspending EU accession talks until at least 2028. But this represented perhaps their most uncontestable move against the will of the public to date. A poll by the American nonprofit National Democratic Institute 1 year before the election had revealed no less than 79% of surveyed respondents supported Georgia's goal to join the EU. But by now, wedded to causing outrage, Georgian Dream invited further scorn with their choice of candidate for the state presidency, with the new term to begin in late December 2024. With pro-Western President Zorabishvili's mandate ending, former professional football player Mikhail Kavlashvili was put forward by his party to replace her. After constitutional changes in 2017, the election of President of Georgia switched from a direct vote by the public to a representative vote by a 300-person college of electors. But with bitter protests over the parliamentary elections ongoing, opposition members of the college chose to boycott the vote, and Kavlashvili was elected unopposed with 100% of the ballot. With that said, a member of the Abkhaz government in exile criticized the electoral system and declared that she would cast her vote against Kavlashvili. Her vote was written off as invalid. Kavlashvili's election led to yet more outrage. It was pointed out that the former football player did not even hold a university degree, and protesters in Tbilisi kicked footballs about in ridicule of his election. However, despite the upheaval and the undoubted enthusiasm for EU and NATO membership, it doesn't by any means mean that the Georgian Dream has no support. On the contrary, the same National Democratic Institute poll from 2023 seemed to refute this quite clearly. When asked whether they were satisfied with their government's performance to date, 54% 60% answered positively. Perhaps most significantly, the poll was carried out in October 2023 after the controversy surrounding both the Foreign Agents Law and the Family Values Law, although before the contested parliamentary and presidential elections. Moreover, another poll from March 2023 had indicated only 43% thought positively of the government's performance. More curiously still, the October poll revealed that 66% of respondents believed that the Georgian Prime Minister, at that time Irakli Garibashvili of Georgian Dream, was doing a good or average job, and only 58% answered the same when queried on the performance of Georgia's pro-Western president, Shalom Zorabichvili. Zorabichvili, born in France to a family of Georgian aristocratic origin, had previously served as France's ambassador to Georgia and later as Georgian foreign minister during Saakashvili's first term as president. She later became an independent MP and was elected Georgia's first female president in 2018. But along the way, she accumulated criticism for flaws in her command of Georgian, claims of her aristocratic aloofness, and also for her supposed closeness with none other than Bidzina Ivanishvili. According to EuroAsiaNet, it was even feared that as a presidential candidate, she would be a shill for Ivanishvili's interests. As president, Zorabichvili has regularly opposed legislative proposals by Georgian Dream, but the proportion of respondents to the October 2023 NDI poll who answered specifically that the president was doing a good job was a meager 16% versus Prime Minister Garibashvili's 29%. Moreover, the question of Georgia's membership of NATO has proven relatively thorny. Although the October NDI poll revealed 67% of Georgians were in favor of joining the military alliance, this was not only significantly less than those who favored EU membership, but less than had answered positively to the same question in March at 73%. Many in Georgia seemed to sense that close ties with NATO would risk an even more terrible intervention by Russia, and that the action plan put forward by Saakashvili in 2008 was the cause of the country's later troubles. Such a feeling was exacerbated by the tepid response by NATO to Russia's war in Ukraine, with many perceiving that Ukraine was left to fend for itself against the onslaught of the Russian invasion. Perhaps even more significantly, around 50% of Georgians answered that their country should either deepen or maintain economic ties with Russia. Again, an increase not only on March of the same year, but also on the years before. For now, the protests in Georgia continue, and further developments are likely to unfold. Following the election of former footballer Kavalashvili, incumbent President Salome Zorabichvili announced that she would not vacate office, citing irregularities with the election procedure. In doing so, however, she risks the hands of the belligerent Georgian Dream and even joining Saakashvili and other opposition figures in prison. Such a fate would likely be nothing short of harrowing. According to a report by Amnesty International, the former president and current honorary chairman of the United National Movement has suffered horrendously during this imprisonment. It was announced that he is suffering from psychological, neurological, orthopedic, and gastrointestinal issues, as well as being subject to several suspected poisonings. Saakashvili has lost half his body weight, with images of his courtroom appearances via video link showing him gaunt and extremely emaciated. Other opposition members have been arrested during the ongoing protests and similarly tossed in prison. This included Nika Gavaramia, leader of the second-placed Coalition for Change, who was beaten unconscious as he was strong-armed into a squad car by balaclava-clad policemen. Meanwhile, former Prime Minister Vane Marashvili was released after almost 7 years imprisonment in 2020 and relegated into political obscurity. Unfortunately, with such great upheaval in the air, only time will tell if Georgia's strife will be met with any kind of positive resolution. Thank you for watching.